There comes a point in life when being around people no longer feels like connection. It feels like noise. Not always loud noise and not necessarily bad in any obvious way, but a kind of inner crowding that slowly makes it harder to hear yourself clearly. You keep talking, responding, showing up, staying available, moving from one interaction to another, and after a while something inside you begins to feel strangely far away. Not because you disappeared, but because you have not been alone long enough to notice what is still yours beneath everyone else's presence. A lot of people are afraid of solitude for reasons they do not fully understand. They think it means loneliness, emptiness, withdrawal, or some kind of emotional loss. They imagine that being alone for a while is what happens when life goes wrong, when relationships fail, or when something is missing. But often the opposite is true. Sometimes solitude is not a sign that your life is collapsing. Sometimes it is the first sign that something in you is trying to return. Because when you are always surrounded by input, by people's moods, opinions, expectations, needs, and emotional patterns, your own inner world starts getting pushed further into the background. You make decisions quickly. You adjust without noticing. You become available in ways that slowly pull you away from yourself. And after enough time, you may still be functioning, still talking, still participating in life, but no longer with the same sense of inner contact you once had. That is where solitude begins to change its meaning. It stops being a gap to fill and starts becoming a space where you can hear what has been drowned out. Your real thoughts, your real fatigue, your real desires. The parts of you that do not speak loudly when life is crowded, but are still there, waiting for enough quiet to become visible again. This episode is about that kind of solitude. Not isolation as punishment, not emotional retreat, but the kind that gives you back your own mind. The kind that loosens unhealthy dependence, sharpens your focus, and helps you return to yourself with more honesty than constant connection often allows. Because sometimes being alone for a while is not what distances you from life. It is what brings you back to it in a way that is finally your own. You reconnect with your real identity. One of the strangest things about modern life is how easy it is to remain functional while becoming increasingly distant from yourself. You keep moving, keep answering, keep participating, keep adapting. You say what needs to be said, do what needs to be done, stay emotionally available in the ways people expect, and from the outside, nothing appears wrong. But somewhere underneath all that movement, a quieter truth begins to form. You are no longer fully in contact with who you are when no one is around. That distance rarely happens all at once. It builds gradually through repetition, through constantly adjusting your tone, your energy, your behavior, your priorities. Through spending so much time in reaction to other people's presence that your own inner direction starts becoming harder to feel. You become skilled at functioning in relationships, conversations, obligations, and environments that constantly ask something from you, but less skilled at hearing what remains when those demands fall silent. That is how identity starts getting blurred. Not because you suddenly become fake, and not because everything in your life is false. It is subtler than that. You still care about real things. You still feel real emotions. But too much of your daily life begins happening in reference to someone or something outside you. Their mood, their expectations, their approval, their timing, their needs, their version of who you are. And after a while, you may still know how to play your role in every setting, while quietly losing access to the part of you that existed before the role began. This is why solitude matters more than many people realize. Because solitude removes the immediate influence of other people long enough for your own shape to become visible again, not the shape that gets activated in conversation, not the shape that emerges under pressure, performance, politeness, attraction, loyalty, guilt, or emotional expectation. Something simpler than that. Something closer to your original center. At first, that can feel unfamiliar. When the noise drops, many people do not immediately feel peaceful. They feel restless, empty, slightly disoriented, and that discomfort is important because it often reveals how rarely they have been alone with themselves in a real way. Not distracted solitude, not half-present solitude with a screen filling every gap. Real solitude, the kind where there is enough stillness for your own thoughts to stop hiding behind momentum. That is where reconnection begins. You start noticing what you actually feel before anyone else's reaction shapes it. You begin to hear opinions that are yours, not inherited from the emotional atmosphere around you. You recognize how much of your behavior had become habitual adaptation rather than intentional choice. You see which parts of your life still feel true, and which parts only continued because you were too surrounded to question them deeply. This can be a confronting process, because when your real identity begins to come back into view, it does not only bring clarity, it also brings the recognition of how much you may have been overriding yourself. How often you said yes while something in you meant no. How often you stayed available when what you needed was distance. How often you became understandable, agreeable, useful, flexible, supportive, or emotionally present in ways that slowly pulled you away from your own internal truth. Solitude gives those truths room to breathe, and once they start breathing, your life begins to feel different. Not instantly easier, but more honest. You stop depending so heavily on the presence of others to feel oriented. You become less likely to mistake external activity for internal meaning. You begin to remember that identity is not only what appears in interaction, it is also what remains when nobody is asking anything from you. That remembrance changes your relationship with yourself. You begin to trust your own preferences more, your own pace, your own way of thinking, your own quiet instincts that had been drowned out by too much noise and too much adaptation. You stop feeling like you need constant relational movement in order to feel real. And in that shift, a deeper kind of self-respect starts returning. The kind that comes not from being admired or understood, but from feeling your life line up more honestly with what is true inside you. So maybe the value of being alone for a while is not only that it gives you rest, maybe it gives you recognition, a chance to see yourself again without everyone else standing in front of the mirror, a chance to remember that beneath all the roles, all the obligations, all the emotional traffic of life, there is still a self there that has not disappeared. It has only been waiting for enough quiet to come back into view. And sometimes that is exactly what solitude gives you, not a new identity, but the return of the one that got lost in too much company. You break emotional dependence on others. One of the hardest forms of dependence to recognize is the kind that does not look dramatic from the outside. You may still appear independent. You handle your responsibilities. You make your own decisions. You move through life without obviously clinging to anyone, and yet something inside you still leans outward more than you realize. Your mood rises and falls with how someone responds. Your sense of closeness depends on whether you feel wanted. Your inner stability becomes shakier when attention changes, warmth changes, or someone becomes harder to read. Nothing has happened in a clearly catastrophic way, but your emotional state has already begun adjusting itself around another person's presence. That is what emotional dependence often feels like. Not open need, but quiet reliance, a subtle habit of looking outside yourself for reassurance, confirmation, comfort, or emotional regulation. It is the pattern of feeling more settled when someone is available, more uncertain when they are distant, more secure when you are being chosen, more unsettled when you are not. And because that pattern can feel so normal, many people never question it deeply. They simply live inside it. They call it love. They call it closeness. They call it caring deeply. And sometimes elements of those things are present. But when your emotional balance depends too heavily on another person's consistency, something inside you becomes fragile. Your inner world is no longer standing fully on its own. It is partially being held together by variables you do not control. That is where solitude becomes important, because being alone for a while interrupts that dependence in a way few other things can. It removes the usual stream of external soothing, the messages, the presence, the contact, the emotional rhythm that your mind may have quietly learned to lean on. And when that stream slows down, the first thing you often notice is discomfort, restlessness, emptiness, a sense that something is missing. But what feels like missing connection is often a deeper realization. You have been using other people to stabilize feelings you were never taught to hold on your own. That can be painful to face, because it means solitude does not only bring freedom, it also exposes where your emotional center has become outsourced. It shows you how quickly your mind wants to move towards someone else in order to feel okay again, how quickly loneliness turns into urgency, how quickly uncertainty becomes a desire to reach, explain, reconnect, or restore the old emotional rhythm. And this is exactly why the solitude matters. Because if you stay with it long enough, something starts changing. The discomfort does not disappear overnight, but it becomes more understandable. You begin to see where your need is genuine and where it is habitual. You begin to notice the difference between love and emotional reliance, between wanting someone and needing them to regulate what you have not yet learned to hold within yourself. That distinction changes everything, because once you stop leaning outward in the same automatic way, your inner world begins to strengthen. You start learning how to sit with your own emotions instead of immediately trying to resolve them through connection. You experience loneliness without assuming it means you must reach for someone. You feel insecurity without instantly handing another person the job of dissolving it for you. That is how emotional independence begins. Not through becoming cold, not through shutting down the need for closeness, but through becoming less fragile in its absence. Through no longer collapsing inward every time the external source of comfort is not there. Through building the ability to stay with yourself in moments where you once would have rushed towards someone else. This does not make future relationships weaker, it makes them cleaner, because when you are less emotionally dependent, you no longer need people in the same desperate way. You can love without clinging. You can care without trying to control. You can appreciate presence without becoming destabilized by distance. Your connections become less driven by fear and more guided by truth. You stop asking others to save you from your own inner discomfort, and because of that, what remains between you becomes more real. So maybe solitude is not taking something from you here. Maybe it is removing the support that kept your deeper dependence hidden. And once that support is gone for long enough, you begin learning something that changes the entire emotional structure of your life. That you can miss people without losing yourself. That you can be alone without becoming emotionally ungrounded. That you can feel deeply and still remain whole. And that is one of the most important freedoms a person can ever build. Solitude reveals your true thoughts. Most people do not realize how rarely they hear their own thoughts in a clean form. Not because they are incapable of thinking deeply, but because their mind is almost always in response to something. A conversation, a message, a piece of content, someone else's opinion, someone else's mood. Even when they are technically alone, their attention is still occupied, still reacting, still moving outward in small, continuous ways. And when the mind is constantly reacting, it becomes difficult to tell what is truly yours. Your thoughts begin blending with what you've just heard. Your opinions begin shaping themselves around what feels acceptable. Your perspective becomes influenced by the emotional tone of the environment you've been in. And after a while, even your inner dialogue starts sounding less like something original and more like an extension of everything you've been exposed to. That is where solitude begins to do something very different. It removes the immediate stream of input long enough for your own thinking to come forward without interference. Not instantly, and not in a perfectly clear way at first. In the beginning, when things get quiet, what often surfaces is not clarity, but noise of a different kind. Leftover conversations, unfinished thoughts, emotional residue from recent interactions. Your mind keeps replaying, adjusting, revisiting, as if it is trying to clear a backlog that has been building beneath constant activity. That stage is important, because it shows you how much of your thinking was never fully processed in the moment. It reveals how much you carry forward without noticing, but if you stay in solitude long enough, something begins to shift. The replay slows down, the borrowed voices fade, the urgency to respond disappears. And underneath all of that, something quieter begins to appear. Your actual thoughts, not the ones shaped for conversation, not the ones adjusted for approval, not the ones influenced by what you think you should believe, but the ones that remain when no one is there to hear them. This can feel unfamiliar, sometimes even uncomfortable, because real thoughts are not always neat. They do not always align with how you present yourself in the world. They may contradict things you have said before. They may reveal doubts, frustrations, desires, or realizations that were easier to ignore when your attention was constantly occupied. And without the distraction of interaction, you are left face to face with them in a more direct way. That is where clarity begins, not the kind that arrives instantly, but the kind that develops when your mind is finally given enough space to organize itself. You begin to see patterns in how you think. You notice where your thoughts are repetitive, where they are reactive, where they are influenced, and where they are genuinely your own. You start distinguishing between what you actually believe and what you have absorbed. And that distinction is powerful, because once you can hear your own thinking clearly, you begin making decisions from a different place, not from pressure, not from expectation, not from the need to keep up with an emotional or social rhythm, but from something more grounded, something that feels internally aligned, even if it is not always easy. Solitude gives you access to that alignment. It allows your mind to move at its natural pace instead of being constantly interrupted. It gives your thoughts time to develop instead of being cut short by the next interaction. It creates the conditions where understanding can deepen instead of staying at the surface. And over time, that changes how you relate to your own mind. You trust it more, not because it is always right, but because it is finally yours. You know what you think, without needing to check it against someone else's reaction. You know what feels true, without needing immediate validation. You are less dependent on external input to form your perspective, because you have spent enough time listening inward to recognize your own voice. That voice becomes a kind of anchor, something you can return to when the outside world becomes loud again. Something that remains steady even when opinions, expectations, and pressures begin pulling in different directions. And without that anchor, it is very easy to become scattered, to think in fragments, to lose clarity every time the environment changes. So maybe solitude is not only about rest. Maybe it is about recognition, the recognition of what your mind sounds like when it is no longer crowded. The recognition of what is truly yours beneath everything you have been responding to. The recognition that clarity does not always require more input. Sometimes it requires less. And once you experience that clearly, even for a short time, it becomes much harder to go back to living entirely in reaction to everything around you. You reset your mental state. There is a kind of mental fatigue that builds so gradually you stop noticing it as something separate from yourself. Your thoughts feel heavier, but you assume that is just how things are. Your patience feels shorter, but you think it is because life is demanding. Your attention feels scattered, but you blame it on everything happening around you. And in a way, all of that is true. But what often goes unseen is how much of that state is not coming from one difficult moment, but from accumulation. Too many interactions without pause, too much input without processing, too many emotional adjustments without recovery. Your mind keeps moving, adapting, responding, carrying, but it rarely gets the chance to fully reset. So it stays slightly overloaded. And when that becomes your normal, even simple things begin to feel heavier than they actually are. This is where solitude begins to work differently than people expect. It is not just a break from people. It is a break from constant internal movement. When you step away long enough, something in your system starts slowing down. The mental pace that had been shaped by conversations, expectations, and continuous input begins to loosen. You are no longer required to respond, no longer adjusting in real time, no longer processing multiple layers of interaction at once. At first, that can feel unfamiliar. The silence may feel louder than expected. The absence of stimulation may create a kind of restlessness. Your mind may try to fill the space quickly, reaching for distraction, for something to engage with, for a way to return to the familiar rhythm of constant activity. But if you stay with it, something begins to shift. The mental pressure starts releasing, thoughts become less crowded. The urgency to think about everything at once begins to fade. You stop jumping from one mental thread to another without finishing any of them. Instead, your mind starts settling into a slower, more natural rhythm. Not forced, not controlled, just less overloaded. That is what a reset feels like. Not dramatic, but noticeable. You begin to see things more clearly, not because the world changed, but because the noise inside you has reduced. Problems that felt overwhelming become more defined. Decisions that felt confusing begin to make more sense. Emotions that were tangled start separating into something you can understand without being consumed by them. This is one of the reasons solitude can feel so relieving after you have been surrounded for too long. It gives your mind the space to reorganize itself. Without constant interruption, your thoughts can finally complete themselves. Without continuous input, your attention can stabilize. Without the pressure to respond, your internal state can begin returning to a more balanced baseline. And that baseline matters more than most people realize. Because how you experience life is not only determined by what happens, but by the condition of your mind when it happens. A cluttered mind makes everything feel more difficult. A restless mind makes everything feel more urgent. A fatigued mind makes everything feel heavier, but a clear mind changes the experience entirely. The same situation can feel completely different, depending on whether your mental state is overloaded or reset. That is why stepping away is not avoidance. It is maintenance. It is giving your mind the conditions it needs to return to a state where it can function well again, where it can think, decide, feel and respond without carrying the residue of everything that came before. And once you experience that reset clearly, even for a short time, it becomes easier to recognize when you are drifting away from it again. You begin to notice when your thoughts are becoming too crowded, when your attention is becoming too fragmented, when your internal state is being shaped more by accumulation than by clarity. That awareness allows you to return sooner, not by escaping life, but by giving yourself just enough space to come back to it with a clearer mind. So maybe solitude is not something you wait for when everything becomes too much. Maybe it is something you use before that happens, a way of keeping your mind from reaching a point where everything feels heavier than it needs to be. Because sometimes the most powerful change is not in what you do more of. It is in what you step away from long enough to think clearly again. You gain clarity about relationships. One of the hardest things to see clearly when you are constantly around people is the truth of the relationships themselves. Not because people are impossible to understand, but because closeness creates its own kind of fog. When you are always in contact, always responding, always involved in the emotional rhythm of someone else's presence, it becomes difficult to tell what is real and what is simply familiar. Familiarity can feel like depth. Constant communication can feel like closeness. Emotional intensity can feel like significance. You get used to the pattern, the timing, the tone, the way someone occupies your mind, and after a while that occupation starts being mistaken for meaning. You assume that because a connection is active, it must also be healthy. Because it is emotionally charged, it must also be important. Because it takes up so much space inside you, it must deserve that space. But that is not always true. And this is exactly where solitude begins to reveal what constant contact keeps hidden. When you step back for a while, when you are no longer inside the daily rhythm of a connection, something changes. The emotional weather starts clearing. The urgency fades. You stop reading every signal in real time. You stop reacting to every tone, every silence, every small shift. And because of that, you begin seeing the relationship from outside its momentum. That distance is clarifying. You start noticing who only felt important because they were always there, who only felt deep because the connection was emotionally noisy, who brought warmth and who brought confusion, who gave you peace and who gave you constant interpretation, who respected your boundaries and who only looked close because you were doing the work of making the relationship feel alive. These things are much harder to see while you are still inside the pattern. Because when you are emotionally entangled, you are not only observing the relationship, you are helping sustain it. You are carrying part of its movement, your effort, your presence, your responsiveness, your patience, your tendency to explain, forgive, or keep things going can make a weak connection feel stronger than it is. But solitude interrupts that support. It removes your constant participation long enough for the structure of the relationship to show itself more honestly. And often, what becomes clear is simpler than what you had been feeling. Some people care, but not deeply enough to carry what you thought they were carrying. Some relationships are warm, but not healthy. Some connections are intense, but not stable. Some people are present, but only because your energy made presence easy for them. And once you are away from the emotional immediacy of it all, you begin to understand that not every bond deserves the place it had in your life. That realization can be painful, because clarity does not only show you what is beautiful, it also shows you where you were hoping more than seeing, where you were calling something mutual that depended too heavily on your effort, where you were staying loyal to the feeling of a connection instead of the truth of what it repeatedly did to your peace. But there is relief in that honesty, because once you see a relationship clearly, you stop wasting so much energy trying to make it mean something it does not. You stop chasing emotional resolution in places that keep producing the same confusion. You stop asking so much from people who have already shown you, quietly and consistently, what they are actually willing to give. And just as importantly, solitude does not only show you what is wrong, it also shows you what is real. It makes you appreciate the people whose presence still feels clean when you are away from them. The ones who do not depend on constant activity to remain meaningful. The ones whose effect on your nervous system is not agitation, but steadiness. The ones you do not have to decode in order to feel close to. Solitude helps you distinguish between what is merely stimulating and what is actually nourishing. That distinction changes the quality of your whole life, because relationships shape your inner world more than people realize. If you are surrounded by dynamics that keep you uncertain, overextended, or emotionally occupied, your mind starts carrying that weight, even when no one is around. But once you become clear about who belongs near you, and who only took up space because you were too close to see properly, your life begins to feel lighter. So maybe the point of being alone for a while is not only to rest from people, maybe it is to finally see them, to let enough distance enter the picture that familiarity stops disguising itself as truth, to understand which relationships remain solid when the noise fades, and which ones only lived through momentum. To stop asking how close something feels and start asking how true it actually is. Because once you see that clearly, you do not just become wiser about others, you become more honest about what your life should keep making room for. Being alone builds self-reliance. There is a difference between appearing independent and actually being able to stand on your own inwardly. A person can manage responsibilities, solve practical problems, and move through life looking capable while still depending on constant contact, reassurance, or emotional nearness more than they realize. They may function well, but the moment they are left alone with themselves for too long, something begins to feel unstable. That is usually where self-reliance has not fully formed yet, because self-reliance is not only about surviving without help. It is about being able to remain emotionally and psychologically steady when no one is there to carry part of you. It is the ability to think, feel, decide, recover, and continue without needing another person's presence to make your inner world feel bearable. And that kind of strength does not grow in constant company. It grows when you spend enough time alone to discover what you can actually hold by yourself. At first, this can feel more confronting than empowering. When you are alone, many things become visible that other people usually help you avoid. Boredom, restlessness, doubt, the need for distraction, the tendency to reach outward the moment discomfort appears. You begin to notice how often your first instinct is not to stay with yourself, but to move toward something or someone that reduces the weight of the moment. That noticing is important, because it reveals where your dependence really is. Not always in dramatic need, but in the smaller reflexes that say, I do not want to sit with this alone. I do not want to think through this alone. I do not want to calm myself, understand myself, or carry myself through this without someone else nearby. Solitude changes that gradually. The more time you spend with yourself without rushing to escape the discomfort, the more your inner structure begins to strengthen. You start solving more of your own emotional friction without immediately outsourcing it. You begin making decisions without needing immediate reassurance. You learn how to sit with uncertainty a little longer before running toward relief. And each time you do that, something small but meaningful gets built inside you. Trust. Not in life becoming easy, but in your ability to handle life when it is not. That is one of the deepest gifts of being alone for a while. You start discovering that many things you thought required someone else's presence can, in fact, be carried by you. You can survive a lonely evening without turning it into a crisis. You can process difficult thoughts without needing instant distraction. You can move through an uncertain period without demanding that someone else stabilize it for you. This does not mean you stop valuing connection. It means connection stops being the only place where you feel safe, clear, or whole. And that changes relationships in a profound way. When you become more self-reliant, you stop approaching people from the same level of hidden need. You no longer expect them to constantly regulate your emotions, restore your balance, or protect you from yourself. You can still love deeply, care sincerely, and remain close, but there is less unconscious pressure inside your connection with them. You are with them because you choose to be, not because you collapse too easily without them. That makes your presence cleaner, more grounded, less demanding in invisible ways, and it makes your bond with yourself stronger too, because each period of solitude becomes less like abandonment and more like proof. Proof that you can hold your own weight. Proof that your inner life does not have to be outsourced. Proof that you are capable of remaining with yourself without immediately trying to escape. And that proof matters, because the more you experience yourself this way, the less frightening life becomes. Not because you expect no loss, no uncertainty, no change, but because you know you can remain standing through more of it than you once believed. Self-reliance does not remove pain. It changes your relationship with dependence inside pain. It teaches you that support is beautiful, but it is not the same thing as survival. So maybe being alone for a while is not only giving you rest. Maybe it is training you to stop abandoning yourself the moment life becomes uncomfortable. Maybe it is showing you that you are more capable than the part of you that always reached outward too quickly ever allowed you to see. Because the truth is, self-reliance is not built in the moments where someone comes to carry you. It is built in the quieter moments where you realize you can carry more of yourself than you thought. You become comfortable with your own presence. There is a difference between being alone and feeling at ease while you are alone. Many people can spend time by themselves, but that time is filled with distraction, restlessness, or a quiet urge to escape. The moment things become too still, something inside starts searching for a screen, a conversation, a voice, a reason to re-enter noise. Not because they dislike themselves in an obvious way, but because they are not fully comfortable sitting in their own presence without something softening the experience. That discomfort is more common than it seems, because when you are used to constant interaction, your sense of self becomes tied to movement, to response, to being engaged, to being seen, heard, or involved in something that gives shape to your experience. And when all of that falls away, what remains can feel unfamiliar. You are left with your thoughts, your feelings, your pace, without anything external organizing it for you. At first, that can feel empty. Not because there is nothing inside you, but because you are not used to meeting yourself without distraction. This is where solitude begins to do its quiet work. The more time you spend alone without immediately filling the space, the more you start encountering yourself directly. Your habits of thinking, your emotional patterns, your pacing, the way your mind moves when no one is influencing it. And at the beginning, that encounter can feel awkward, even slightly uncomfortable, because there is nothing to hide behind. But if you stay with it, something begins to soften. The unfamiliar starts becoming familiar. You begin noticing that you can sit with yourself without needing to change the moment. That your presence is not something you have to escape from. That your thoughts do not need to be replaced immediately. That silence is not something to rush through, but something you can exist within without tension. That is where comfort begins to grow. Not in a dramatic way, but in small shifts. You stop reaching for distraction as quickly. You become less impatient with quiet. You notice that being alone does not automatically mean something is missing. It simply means nothing external is filling the space, and that space can start to feel less threatening over time. This changes how you experience yourself. You begin to feel more at home in your own company. Not because everything inside you is perfect, but because you are no longer resisting it as strongly. You can sit with your thoughts without needing to fix them immediately. You can experience your emotions without rushing to resolve them through external means. You can exist without constantly needing something to happen. That is a powerful shift, because once you are comfortable with your own presence, you stop needing others in the same way. You still value connection, but it is no longer a way to escape yourself. It becomes something you enter from a place of wholeness, not from a place of subtle avoidance. Your time alone stops feeling like a gap. It becomes a space where you can rest, think, recover, and simply be without pressure. And that space strengthens you in ways that are not always obvious at first. Your mind becomes less dependent on stimulation. Your emotional state becomes less reactive to silence. Your attention becomes more stable because it is no longer constantly searching for something to attach to. Over time, this comfort becomes part of how you move through life. You do not feel the same urgency to fill every moment. You do not feel unsettled by pauses in conversation, gaps in communication, or time without activity. You carry a quieter confidence, not because you are trying to appear self-sufficient, but because you know you can remain with yourself without needing to escape. That confidence is subtle, but people feel it, because a person who is comfortable alone does not bring the same restless energy into interactions. They are not trying to extract something from every moment. They are not trying to be constantly reassured, entertained, or engaged. They can be present without pressure because they are not trying to avoid themselves while they are with others. And that makes their presence feel different, calmer, more grounded, less demanding. So maybe the point of being alone for a while is not only to understand yourself. Maybe it is to become okay with yourself, to reach a place where your own presence no longer feels like something you need to escape from. To sit in silence without immediately searching for noise. To exist without needing constant input to feel steady, because once that becomes natural, you are no longer dependent on the world to keep you from feeling uncomfortable with yourself. And that changes everything. You are not just able to be alone, you are able to be with yourself, without resistance. You stop seeking constant validation. One of the quiet patterns that shapes how many people move through life is the need to be confirmed. Not always in obvious ways, and not always through direct approval, but in smaller, repeated signals that say, you're okay, you're seen, you're valued, you're doing this right. A message gets answered and you feel settled. A response feels distant and something shifts inside you. You share something and wait, not just for feedback, but for a kind of emotional confirmation. And over time, without noticing, parts of your inner stability begin to depend on these small external signals. That is how validation becomes a quiet habit. It does not always look like insecurity. Sometimes it looks like connection, like communication, like normal human exchange. But beneath it, there can be a subtle leaning outward, a tendency to check your sense of self against how others respond to you in the moment. And when that pattern repeats long enough, your inner state becomes less self-sustained. You feel more stable when you are affirmed, more uncertain when you are not, even if nothing has objectively changed. This is where solitude begins to reveal something important. When you spend time alone, those external signals disappear. The usual feedback loop is no longer there. No immediate responses, no subtle confirmations, no quick way to check how you're being received. And at first, that absence can feel uncomfortable because it removes something your system has quietly relied on. You may notice a tendency to reach outward, to check your phone, to imagine how others would respond to what you are thinking or doing. That impulse is not random. It is the habit of seeking validation, trying to restore itself. But if you stay in solitude long enough, something begins to shift. You start noticing that you can exist without constant confirmation, that your thoughts can stand without being immediately shared, that your decisions can hold without being approved, that your sense of self does not have to be updated every time someone reacts to you, and that realization begins to loosen the pattern. You stop needing to check yourself through others in the same way. You begin trusting your own perception a little more, your own judgment, your own sense of what feels right or aligned, even when no one is there to affirm it. This does not mean you stop valuing feedback. It means you stop depending on it to feel stable. That difference changes everything. Because once you are less driven by the need for validation, your behavior becomes cleaner. You speak more honestly, because you are not shaping everything for approval. You make decisions with more clarity, because you are not constantly second-guessing yourself based on imagined reactions. You stop over-explaining, over-adjusting, over-performing in subtle ways just to maintain a sense of being accepted. Your presence becomes more grounded, not because you are trying to prove anything, but because you are no longer quietly asking to be confirmed at every step. This also changes how you experience others. You begin to notice who interacts with you in a real way and who only engages when there is something to gain emotionally. You become less affected by inconsistency because your sense of self is no longer tied to how often someone shows up or how they respond. You stop reading every silence as rejection, every delay as a problem, every shift as something you need to fix. And that reduces a lot of unnecessary emotional tension. Because much of what people feel as anxiety in relationships is not coming from what is actually happening, but from the need to constantly be reassured that everything is okay. When that need softens, the entire experience becomes lighter. You can let things breathe. You can let people be who they are without needing immediate confirmation that they feel the way you hope they do. You can allow space without filling it with interpretation, and that creates a different kind of confidence. Not loud, not performative, but steady. A confidence that comes from knowing you do not need constant external input to feel grounded, that your inner state does not collapse in the absence of immediate feedback, that you can move through your life without needing to check your reflection in every interaction. So maybe solitude is not taking validation away from you. Maybe it is showing you that you can exist without needing it as much as you thought. And once that becomes clear, you begin to carry yourself differently. Less dependent, less reactive, more certain from within. And that certainty becomes something no external response can easily give or take away. Solitude sharpens focus. Focus is often treated like a discipline problem. People assume they cannot concentrate because they are lazy, distracted, or lacking willpower. But very often the deeper issue is not weakness. It is crowding, too many inputs, too many emotional residues, too many unfinished interactions still taking up space inside the mind. A distracted mind is not always an undisciplined mind. Sometimes it is simply an overstimulated one. When you are constantly around people, constantly available, constantly in some kind of social or emotional motion, your attention becomes fragmented in ways that are easy to normalize. A conversation stays with you longer than it should. Someone's mood still lingers in your body. A message you have not answered remains quietly open in the background of your mind. Even when you sit down to focus, parts of your attention are still scattered across other places. That is why solitude can feel so different from ordinary rest. It does not only reduce noise around you, it gradually reduces noise within you. The social field begins to loosen. The ongoing pressure to answer, read, anticipate, or emotionally adjust starts fading. And as that pressure fades, attention begins returning to itself. At first, this does not always feel like focus. Often it feels like withdrawal from stimulation. The mind still wants to reach outward. It looks for something to check, something to follow, something to react to. That impulse can make solitude feel strangely restless in the beginning. Not because solitude is empty, but because the mind has become used to being fed by interruption. But if you stay in that quieter space long enough, something begins to settle. The need to scan lessens. The mind stops jumping as quickly. Your attention starts gathering instead of scattering. And what returns is not forced concentration, but a more natural form of focus. The kind that appears when there is finally enough room to stay with one thought, one task, one feeling, one direction, without everything else constantly pulling at the edges of your awareness. That changes more than productivity. It changes the quality of your whole inner life. Because focus is not only about getting things done, it is about depth. It is about being able to remain with what matters long enough for it to become meaningful. A focused mind can understand more deeply, create more honestly, feel more clearly, and make decisions with less confusion. But none of that is easy when your attention is being continuously broken by the emotional traffic of daily life. Solitude gives you a chance to rebuild that continuity. You begin to notice how much easier it is to think when you are not also processing other people. How much more clearly you can see a problem when no one else's energy is sitting on top of it. How much more naturally your mind can move when it is not constantly being interrupted by messages, expectations, reactions, or the subtle pressure of social presence. And with that clarity, a different kind of strength appears. You stop being so available to distraction, not because you have become rigid, but because your mind remembers what it feels like to be undivided. You begin protecting your attention more carefully. You start noticing how much is lost when your focus keeps getting broken before it has had the chance to deepen. That awareness matters, because a distracted life is often not built out of one major problem. It is built out of constant, tiny fractures in attention. A thought interrupted here, a feeling cut short there, a task abandoned because the mind has already been pulled in 3 other directions, and over time, those fractures make life feel shallow, rushed, and mentally exhausting. Solitude helps reverse that. It does not make the world less distracting, but it gives you back the experience of an unfragmented mind. And once you know what that feels like again, even briefly, it becomes much harder to tolerate the constant scattering that once felt normal. So maybe being alone for a while is not only about recovery, maybe it is about restoring your capacity to stay with what matters, to let your attention deepen again, to let your thoughts finish, to let your mind stop living in fragments. Because in the end, focus is not simply something you force. Often, it is something that returns when there is finally enough quiet for it to exist. You build emotional independence. There is a point where being alone stops feeling like something you are enduring and starts feeling like something that is strengthening you. Not because you suddenly stop needing people and not because connection loses its value, but because your emotional center begins to stand on its own in a way it did not before. Emotional independence is often misunderstood. People think it means not caring, not feeling, or becoming detached in a way that makes you unreachable. But real emotional independence is something much quieter than that. It is the ability to feel deeply without becoming dependent on someone else to stabilize those feelings. It is the ability to experience closeness without losing your center when that closeness changes. And that ability is very hard to build when you are never alone, because when you are constantly around people, your emotions begin syncing with theirs. Their presence steadies you, their absence unsettles you, their attention lifts you, their distance lowers you. You may not notice it clearly, but your inner state starts becoming partially shaped by the rhythm of someone else's behavior. That is where independence weakens. Not because you are incapable, but because your system has not had enough time to learn how to regulate itself without external support. Solitude changes that. When you are alone for long enough, the usual emotional anchors are no longer there. No one is immediately reflecting you back to yourself. No one is regulating the atmosphere around you. No one is subtly helping your mind settle, your mood lift, or your uncertainty ease. And at first, that absence can feel heavy. You may notice your emotions more strongly. You may feel waves of loneliness, restlessness, or uncertainty that you would normally soften through interaction. And that discomfort is not a sign that something is wrong. It is a sign that something is being revealed. You are meeting your emotions without the usual buffer. And if you stay with that experience instead of escaping it, something important begins to happen. You start learning how to hold yourself, not in a forced way, not through suppression, but through familiarity. You experience your emotions without immediately needing to resolve them through someone else. You feel discomfort without turning it into urgency. You allow loneliness to exist without treating it as a problem that must be fixed instantly. And in that process, your system adapts. What once felt overwhelming begins to feel manageable. What once triggered immediate reaching outward begins to settle on its own. Your emotions stop feeling like something that requires external handling. They become something you can experience, understand, and move through without losing your balance. That is emotional independence. Not the absence of need, but the absence of collapse. You can miss someone without feeling destabilized. You can feel uncertain without losing your sense of direction. You can experience emotional intensity without needing immediate relief from outside yourself. And that changes how you move through relationships. You become less reactive to distance, less anxious about shifts, less driven by the need to constantly secure closeness. You stop trying to control what cannot be controlled because your stability no longer depends entirely on it. That makes your connections healthier, because you are no longer asking people to carry what you have learned to carry yourself. You can still be open, still be vulnerable, still be deeply connected, but without the hidden weight of dependence underneath it. Your presence becomes lighter, more grounded, less fragile. And at the same time, your relationship with yourself becomes stronger. You begin to trust that whatever you feel, you can stay with it. That whatever comes up, you do not have to escape it immediately. That your inner world is not something that needs constant external support in order to remain intact. That trust is powerful, because it removes a quiet fear that many people carry without realizing it. The fear that without others, they would not feel okay. The fear that their emotional state depends too heavily on external presence to stand on its own. Solitude shows you that this is not entirely true. It shows you that while connection enriches your life, it does not have to hold it together. And once you experience that clearly, something shifts. You are no longer moving through life looking for someone to stabilize you. You are moving through life already stable and choosing connection from that place. You return stronger to social life. There is a common fear underneath solitude that many people never say out loud. If I step back too much, will I become distant? Will I lose my connection to people? Will I become too used to being alone? Will something in me grow colder? But real solitude, when it is lived well, does not weaken your connection to life. It refines it. Because the point of stepping away for a while is not to disappear from the world. It is to stop arriving in it fragmented, overextended, emotionally dependent, and mentally crowded. It is to return to yourself long enough that when you do come back into relationships, conversations, and responsibilities, you are no longer entering them from depletion. You are entering them from wholeness. That changes the entire quality of your presence. When you have spent time alone in a real way, not hiding, not numbing, but actually allowing your mind and emotions to settle, something in you becomes cleaner. Your thoughts are less tangled, your boundaries are less confused, your need for constant reassurance is softer, your sense of identity is more stable, and because of that, the way you relate to other people begins to shift without you needing to force anything. You stop reaching so quickly, you stop over-explaining so often. You stop entering every interaction with the same hidden hunger for affirmation, clarity, or emotional regulation. And that makes your social life stronger, not weaker. Because one of the reasons relationships become strained is not always conflict. Sometimes it is over-dependence, too much need hidden under politeness, too much emotional leakage hidden under communication. Too much pressure placed on ordinary interactions to carry things they were never meant to carry. A person who has not spent enough time alone often enters relationships asking for more than they realize. More reassurance, more consistency, more emotional management, more proof that everything is okay. But when solitude has done its work, that pressure begins to ease. You are still warm, but less needy. Still open, but less easily destabilized. Still present, but less dependent on constant contact to feel secure. That creates a very different kind of social energy, one that feels more grounded, more relaxed, more honest. People can feel when someone is with them by choice rather than by hidden emotional desperation. And that difference makes connection cleaner. You also begin seeing other people more accurately. When you have taken time to separate from the emotional noise of constant interaction, you return with better judgment. You notice more quickly who feels nourishing and who feels draining, who brings steadiness and who brings confusion, who respects your space and who only feels close when they have constant access to it. Solitude sharpens your ability to feel the truth of a connection without immediately losing yourself inside it. That makes you less likely to return to old patterns just because they are familiar. And there is another change that matters just as much. You become easier to be around. Not because you become entertaining or agreeable, but because your presence carries less unspoken pressure. You are not unconsciously asking everyone to manage your emotions. You are not bringing the same level of internal chaos into every room. You are not so hungry for connection that every interaction has to become emotionally significant. There is more room around you, more ease, more calm, and people often trust that without fully knowing why. That is one of the paradoxes of healthy solitude. Time alone can make you better in relationship because it removes so much of what was quietly distorting your way of being with others. It teaches you how to stay connected to yourself while also being connected to people, and that is what allows closeness to stop feeling like self-loss. So maybe the point was never to become someone who needs no one. Maybe the point was to become someone who can return to others without abandoning themselves in the process. That kind of return is different. You listen more cleanly, you choose more carefully, you connect more honestly. You leave more clearly when something is wrong, and you appreciate what is real without needing to turn it into emotional dependence. Because after a while, solitude stops feeling like a retreat from life. It starts feeling like preparation for a better way of entering it. And when you return from that place, you do not just come back rested. You come back more whole than when you left. Conclusion. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is step away long enough to hear what your life sounds like without everyone else inside it. Not forever, not as escape, not because people are the problem in some simple way, but because without periods of real solitude, it becomes too easy to lose yourself gradually, to adapt so often that you no longer know what is truly yours, to depend so quietly on attention, closeness, or emotional noise that your own center becomes harder to feel, to keep moving through life surrounded, connected, available, and still feel inwardly distant from yourself. That is what being alone for a while begins to undo. It brings you back into contact with your own mind, your real thoughts, your real fatigue, your real desires. It shows you where you have become dependent, where you have become blurred, where you have been asking relationships to carry what only solitude could reveal, and slowly it begins rebuilding something deeper than rest. It begins rebuilding self-contact. You become more able to sit with your own emotions, more able to hear your own voice, more honest about the relationships in your life, more comfortable in your own company, less hungry for constant validation, less likely to confuse activity with meaning, closeness with clarity, or emotional intensity with truth. And because of that, when you return to the world, you do so differently, less reactive, less dependent, less scattered, more grounded in something that does not disappear the moment the room changes. That is why solitude matters. Not because life is best lived alone, but because now and then being alone is what allows you to return to life without losing yourself inside it. And for many people, that is not a small thing. It is the beginning of becoming someone whose presence, choices, and relationships are no longer built around fear of emptiness, but around a quieter, stronger sense of who they are when nothing external is telling them what to feel. Because sometimes being alone for a while is not what takes you away from life. It is what finally returns you to it.